It was a dreary Tuesday evening when Susan Jenkins found herself stranded on the shoulder of a desolate road. Her car, a faithful but aging sedan, had given its final cough and sputtered before resigning itself to a mechanical purgatory. The rain fell in steady sheets, blurring the edges of the empty stretch of asphalt and amplifying the isolation. Susan was no stranger to mishaps, but this felt like an outright betrayal from her trusty vehicle. She pulled her jacket tighter, resigned to a long wait for help. But before we proceed further, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. As headlights pierced the gloom, Susan waved instinctively, her hand hesitant. Hitchhiking wasn't exactly her style, but desperate times called for unconventional measures. The sleek black car slowed down, a sharp contrast to her beat-up sedan. The driver's side window glided down, revealing a man in his 40s with a mop of unruly hair and a slightly distracted demeanor. "Need a lift?" he asked, his tone casual, as if stopping for strangers in the rain was part of his nightly routine. He had a faint accent, clipped but warm, and his voice carried a distinct mixture of confidence and nonchalance. Susan hesitated. She wasn't one to climb into random cars, but something about his awkward grin and the unpretentious way he gestured to the passenger seat made her decide he wasn't a serial killer. "Yeah," she said, shivering, "if you don't mind." The man leaned over to open the door. "Not at all. Hop in." The interior of the car smelled faintly of leather and mint. Susan glanced around, noticing the unusual dashboard, minimal, clean, with a massive screen dominating the console. It was unlike anything she'd seen before, but she didn't dwell on it. The warmth of the heated seat was enough of a blessing. "Where to?" the man asked, shifting the car into drive. Susan rattled off her destination, a small suburban neighborhood just outside town. He nodded and began steering through the rain with practiced ease, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. For someone who had just offered a ride to a stranger, he seemed oddly preoccupied, as though his mind was juggling half a dozen thoughts at once. The conversation started awkwardly. Susan, always one for pleasantries, asked what he did for a living. He paused for a moment, then shrugged. "Oh, a bit of this and that," he said, which seemed like an evasion, but Susan didn't press. Instead, she told him about her car troubles per week at work and her cat, Whiskers, who seemed to enjoy knocking over her coffee more than he enjoyed being petted. The man chuckled at the mention of Whiskers, a genuine laugh that softened his otherwise intense expression. As the miles rolled by, Susan noticed a curious mix of contradictions in her companion. He was charming but not polished, like someone who had stumbled into charisma without trying. His sentences were punctuated by long silences, yet he radiated a quiet self-assurance. And then there was the car, silent, smooth, gliding over potholes like they weren't even there. "What kind of car is this?" she asked, breaking one of those silences. "A Tesla," he replied, his eyes flicking to her for a brief moment. She nodded, vaguely familiar with the name. "Fancy. Did it come with the heated seats, or is that extra?" This time, his laugh was fuller, almost boyish. "Standard issue," he said, a trace of amusement in his voice. By the time they'd pulled into her neighborhood, the rain had eased into a mist. Susan pointed out her house, and the man stopped smoothly at the curb. She thanked him profusely, offering to pay for gas or buy him a coffee, but he waved her off. "Just glad I could help," he said, his hand resting briefly on the steering wheel before he drove off, the car disappearing as silently as it had arrived. Life went on for Susan after that night. She told a few friends about the mysterious Good Samaritan with the cool car, but the story was more anecdotal than remarkable. It wasn't until 3 years later, while scrolling through a news article, that her memory jolted awake. The headline read, "Elon Musk unveils new SpaceX rocket." There, staring back at her, was the same unruly-haired man with the distracted grin. Her first thought was disbelief, surely not. But as she dug deeper, watching interviews and piecing together fragments of his story, the evidence mounted. The man who had given her a ride on that rainy night was the billionaire CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, a pioneer of electric cars and space exploration, and one of the most talked-about figures of the 21st century. Susan felt a mixture of astonishment and absurdity. For 3 years, she had been telling people about the nice guy with the Tesla, never once realizing she had shared a car with a global icon. The memory of his casual shrug when she asked what he did for a living now seemed hilariously understated. "A bit of this and that," he'd said, as though running multi-billion-dollar companies was a weekend hobby. The revelation turned her simple story into a highlight reel in her social circle. Friends teased her relentlessly, while coworkers exaggerated the encounter into mythical proportions. "So, when's Elon taking you to Mars?" one joked. But Susan couldn't help but appreciate the absurd normalcy of their interaction. For all his fame and accomplishments, Elon Musk had come across as a regular guy offering a lift, without pretense or fanfare. The more Susan thought about that rainy evening, the more it became clear to her how unusual it was. In a world where most people hesitate to lend a helping hand to a stranger, this man, Elon Musk, as it turned out, had stopped without hesitation. It wasn't just the act of offering her a ride that stood out. It was the sheer unpretentiousness of it. Here was someone whose time was arguably worth millions, yet he had spent nearly half an hour helping an ordinary woman with nothing to gain from it. Over the years, Susan began to notice how the story of that encounter shaped her perspective. Whenever she heard people debating Musk's merits, his bold ambitions, his controversial opinions, or his ventures into space and renewable energy, she felt an oddly personal connection to the man behind the headlines. To her, he wasn't just a billionaire genius making waves in the tech world. He was also someone who had taken the time to notice her waving hand on a stormy night. Reflecting on the details, she recalled moments that had once seemed trivial but now carried deeper meaning. For instance, the way his car had driven so smoothly, almost eerily so. She remembered asking him about it, and he'd simply mentioned it was autonomous, mostly. At the time, she hadn't grasped the significance of that statement. Now, she realized she had been riding in the embodiment of years of innovation, a product that symbolized Musk's mission to revolutionize transportation. What struck her most, though, was the memory of his demeanor. He had been kind but not overly polished, distant but not detached. He seemed like someone juggling the weight of too many worlds yet still finding time to stop and share a moment of quiet humanity. His laugh had been genuine, and his questions about her life had felt more than polite, like he was genuinely interested, despite the vast gulf in their respective worlds. As the years went by, Susan's story grew into a favorite among her friends and family. Whenever someone brought up Musk's achievements or controversies, she'd pipe in with her now famous anecdote. "Did you know he once gave me a ride?" She'd say, and without fail, people would lean in eager for details. She'd tell them about his unkempt hair, his low-key humor, and the way he'd brushed off her offer of coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world. Though she never saw him again, Susan often wondered if Musk remembered that night. Was it just another fleeting moment in his whirlwind of a life, or did he sometimes think about the stranger he helped on a rainy evening? It didn't really matter, she supposed. What mattered was the lesson it left her with, that even the busiest, most influential people have the capacity for small acts of kindness, and that those acts can ripple out in ways no one ever expects. In her quiet moments, Susan liked to think of it as a metaphor for Musk's work. Just as he had stopped to help her, he seemed to be stopping to help humanity on its journey, through innovation, risk-taking, and yes, a touch of eccentricity. And while the rest of the world debated his legacy, Susan held onto the simple truth of her experience, that for one rainy night, the man who dreamed of Mars was simply someone who stopped to help. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content. We thrive on your feedback, so be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time, keep discovering and stay tuned.